She stood in front of an entire wedding, looked me in the eye, and told me to get up. Not quietly, not politely. She raised her voice so everyone could hear. And at 79 years old, I had to decide whether I was going to shrink or finally stand my ground. My name is Magnolia Baines, though nearly everyone who truly knows me calls me Maggie. I am 79 years old, and I have lived my entire life in Savannah, Georgia. I was born here in a small white house not far from the river. I raised my children here, I buried my husband here. And if the Lord is willing, I will also take my final breath here. Savannah is not just where I live. It is in my bones. It is in the way I notice the Spanish moss moving in the wind. It is in the smell of wet earth after rain and the way the evening light softens every brick street and square into something almost holy. I have spent most of my life in service to others, though I never called it that at the time. For 31 years I worked as a school librarian at Hartwell Elementary. I know that sounds simple enough, but there was nothing simple about the life I built in those walls. I knew hundreds of children by name. I knew which ones preferred adventure stories, which ones hid behind chapter books because they were shy, and which ones came into the library simply because they needed a quiet place to feel safe for a little while. There is a kind of joy in watching a child discover a book that changes them. A child walks in with dust on their shoes and uncertainty in their eyes, and they leave holding a story like it belongs to them. I spent decades helping children find stories that gave them courage, laughter, and sometimes even comfort when life at home was hard. That was my work. That was my calling. And I loved it. I retired 11 years ago, but I have never been idle. I tend my garden every morning when the weather allows it. I go to church on Sundays. I drink coffee with my neighbor Carol, who has been my dearest friend for more than 20 years. And when my grandchildren are willing to make time for an old woman and her complicated relationship with video calls, I sit on my porch and let them show me their lives through a glowing little screen. My life is quiet now. It is not glamorous. It is not dramatic. But it is mine, and I have earned every peaceful day of it. I have 3 children. My oldest is Patricia, who lives in Charlotte and has inherited my stubborn streak, though she hides it better than I do. My middle child is Dennis, who moved all the way out to Phoenix years ago and still acts surprised that I worry about him. And my youngest is Robert, my gentle boy. The one who always seemed softer than the others. The one who brought home injured birds, stray cats, and sad expressions that I could never quite resist. Robert stayed in Savannah. He built a life here. He works in insurance. He owns a nice house not too far from mine. He is 52 now. Though to me there are still moments when I see the little boy who used to fall asleep on the sofa with a comic book on his chest. Then, about 6 years ago, Robert met Tiffany. Tiffany Cross she was then. Tiffany Baines she is now. She is 44 years old, works in real estate, and from the first time Robert brought her to my Sunday table, I felt something in my chest tighten just a little. Not enough to be unfair. Not enough to accuse. But enough to notice. Now, I have lived long enough to know that a woman does not always have to be obviously cruel to be dangerous to your peace. Sometimes she smiles too tightly. Sometimes she speaks with polished sweetness that somehow still leaves you feeling small. Sometimes she says things that sound harmless until you repeat them in your head later and realize they were meant to cut. At first I told myself I was being too cautious. I told myself I was simply protective of my son. So I welcomed her. I smiled. I invited her to holidays. I asked about her work. I asked about her family. I did what any good mother would do. I made room. Robert seemed happy, and that mattered to me. It mattered more than my private unease, so I set it aside. My nephew Gerald is my late brother William's son. William passed away 8 years ago, and losing him broke something deep in me. He was my older brother, the one who looked out for me when we were young, the one who could make me laugh even when I was angry, the one who understood our family in a way nobody else ever could. When he died, I made a promise to myself that I would stay close to his son. And Gerald let me. He grew into a fine man. Kind, respectful, thoughtful in ways that many younger men no longer bother to be. He calls me Aunt Maggie, and there is tenderness in the way he says it that always makes my heart ache just a little. He never forgot me, never treated me like some old relative to be politely tolerated. He remembered birthdays. He asked about my garden. He called just to check in. He was the kind of young man who restored your faith in family. When he got engaged to Denise, he called me before he told anyone else outside the immediate circle. He said, "Aunt Maggie, I want you to be the first person after our parents to know because you've always mattered to me." I sat in my kitchen and cried into my tea that night. So when he and Denise planned their wedding, I was honored to be part of it. It was held on a beautiful September afternoon just outside Savannah, at a restored plantation venue with tall white columns, wide lawns, and magnolia trees blooming proudly along the drive. The place was elegant without being showy. It felt like the sort of place where family history could settle comfortably into the air. A few weeks before the wedding, Gerald came by my house himself. He sat at my kitchen table with me and coffee and told me where I was going to sit. He said, "Aunt Maggie, I made sure you're in the second row on the left side, third seat in. Patricia will be near you. You'll have a perfect view of everything." That mattered to me. Not because I needed attention, but because it told me he had thought of me. He had taken care. At my age, that kind of care means everything. So on the day of the wedding, I dressed with pride. I wore my navy blue dress with the white trim, the one Patricia gave me 2 Christmases ago. I put on the pearl earrings that belonged to my mother. I brushed my hair until it shone and pinned it back the way I like it when I want to feel composed. I looked in the mirror and saw an old woman, yes, but not a defeated one. A woman with dignity. A woman with history. A woman who knew exactly who she was. Patricia drove down from Charlotte and came with me. We arrived early enough that people were still finding their seats. The afternoon light was golden, warm, and soft in that special Savannah way that makes even a simple moment look sacred. We walked together to the ceremony seating area. And there it was, the place Gerald had described to me. Second row, left side, third seat in. Exactly as promised. I sat down, Patricia beside me, and we began looking around at the guests arriving. Everything felt calm, ceremonial, and full of anticipation. Then Robert and Tiffany arrived. I saw Robert first. He smiled and gave me that easy, affectionate look he still has when he is relaxed. He started walking over to greet me, and I smiled back. Tiffany was just behind him. The moment she saw me seated there, I watched something shift in her face. It was subtle, but I have known her long enough to recognize that look. She was deciding something. And whatever she had decided, it did not include respecting the arrangement. She looked at the chair, then at me. Then she said, "Oh, Maggie, actually I need that seat." I blinked at her. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Gerald told me this is my seat." She barely softened her expression. "Well, I have some back issues and I need to be near the aisle. You can just move over." Now let me be clear about something. I was not sitting in the aisle seat. Patricia was. I was the third seat in from the aisle. There were other seats nearby that were still open. She had options. She wanted my seat specifically, and the tone she used told me that this was not really about her back. I kept my voice calm. "Tiffany, Gerald placed me here himself, and I'd like to stay where he put me." She sighed loud enough for a few heads to turn. "It will not make any difference if you just move down one." I could feel the pressure in the air. The kind of pressure some people create when they are used to getting their way. The kind that says, "Don't make this difficult. Don't embarrass me. Don't resist. Just comply and make it easy for me to take what I want." But something in me had shifted. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the years of swallowing discomfort to keep the peace. Maybe it was simply that I was tired. Whatever it was, I did not move. I said still quietly, "I understand you're uncomfortable, but Gerald arranged these seats himself and I intend to stay here." That was when she straightened. That was when her voice changed. And that was when she made sure everyone around us could hear. "Magnolia," she said sharply, "I need you to get up and move right now. You are being selfish and difficult, and this is embarrassing. Just get up." Her words rang out clear across the row. People turned. The elderly woman behind us stared openly. A man 2 rows back lifted his eyebrows. Patricia beside me went still in a way I had never seen from her before. The whole moment took on that awful, strange quality that humiliating moments always have, where time seems to stretch and sharpen into something painful and bright. And there I was, 79 years old, pearl earrings, navy blue dress, hands folded in my lap, and a daughter-in-law telling me to stand up and give her my seat in front of God and everyone. I could have cried. I could have shouted. Instead, I stood slowly, not because I was yielding to her, but because I refused to become the spectacle she was trying to create. I looked her in the eye and said in my ordinary library voice, the same steady voice I once used with children who were frightened or angry or in need of calm, "Tiffany, I have done nothing to you today except sit in the seat Gerald gave me. What you've just done in front of all these people is something you will have to live with." Then I turned to Patricia and said, "Come with me, please." And we walked away. Patricia took my arm immediately. She did not say much, and she did not need to. Sometimes love sounds like silence. We walked together to the side of the ceremony area until we found a young usher in a dark suit holding a clipboard and looking nervous enough to be helpful. His name was Marcus. I kept my voice low and calm. I did not want to create more scene than had already been made. I told him there had been a seating confusion and asked if he could please help me understand where I was meant to be. Marcus asked my name, checked his list, and then his eyes widened. "Mrs. Baines," he said, almost breathless, "you're on the priority family list. Your seat was personally flagged by the groom." I stared at him for a second. It was. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Immediate family." That was all he needed to say. Marcus didn't hesitate. He walked Patricia and me right back to the row. His posture changed too. He was still polite, but now there was firmness in it. He told the nearby guests that these seats were reserved for designated family members. And just like that, the truth stepped into the light. Robert looked confused at first, then concerned. Then, as he watched Marcus direct me back into my seat, I saw realization begin to settle over his face. He had not known. That much was clear to me almost immediately. Robert was not a cruel man. He was simply a man who had not been told the whole story. Tiffany, however, looked furious. She had clearly expected compliance, not correction. She had expected me to fold. Instead, she had been publicly shown to be wrong. She moved. Not graciously, not kindly, but she moved because Marcus was standing there with the groom's instructions in hand, and there was no room left for her to argue. Patricia and I sat down again. The woman behind us leaned forward and touched my shoulder with the softest, warmest gesture. "You handled that beautifully," she whispered. I thanked her, though I knew I had barely begun to handle anything at all. I sat very straight in my chair and turned back toward the front. The ceremony was about to begin, and I had no intention of allowing Tiffany's behavior to take the focus away from Gerald and Denise. The music started. People stood. Denise appeared at the end of the aisle looking radiant in her dress. Gerald's face changed the instant he saw her. The whole ugly moment from earlier seemed to lose its power under the weight of that honest, simple love. Gerald cried. Denise cried. Patricia held my hand and I held hers back. For those minutes, the whole world narrowed to one thing only: the beauty of two people making vows with their families surrounding them. And I was there, where I belonged. After the ceremony, the reception began, and I could feel the tension starting to simmer beneath the surface, though no one said much at first. Gerald came to find me not long after guests began mingling. He hugged me tightly. Too tightly, maybe because he was worried. "Aunt Maggie," he said, "are you okay?" I heard there was trouble with the seating. I told him the truth, plainly and without dramatics. I explained exactly what Tiffany had said and how she had spoken to me. As I spoke, I watched his expression change. His jaw got tight. His eyes went still. And when I finished, he took both my hands and said, "I am so sorry. That should never have happened. You are the most important person here to me after my parents." I told him it was his wedding night and that he should not spend it worrying about me. He looked at me and said, "Aunt Maggie, with all the love in my heart, I am handling this tonight." And he did. I did not hear every word of the conversation he had with Robert, but I saw enough from across the room to understand that it was serious. Robert's expression changed through several stages: confusion, discomfort, realization, and finally visible distress. Then he came over to me. He sat beside me and took my hand. "Mom," he said, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what she said to you. I was at the back talking to Uncle Terrence when it happened. I am so sorry." I looked at my son and I believed him. Not because mothers are obligated to excuse their children, but because I knew his face. I knew the sincerity in his voice. And I knew that for all the things he had become tangled in with Tiffany, he still had the same heart he had as a child when he came running to me with scraped knees and frightened eyes. "I know you didn't know," I told him. "I know, baby." And I meant it. He squeezed my hand and stayed beside me for a while. The rest of the evening continued, but the air had changed. Tiffany did not approach me. Not once. She did not apologize that night. She did not explain herself. She stayed on the far side of the room and I stayed in mine. When it was time to leave, Robert hugged me goodbye. He leaned close and whispered, "I'm going to fix this, Mom." I patted his cheek the way I used to when he was small. We both knew something had broken. But I also knew that broken things can sometimes be repaired if people are willing to face what happened honestly. In the days after the wedding, the story moved through the family in the way these things always do. Families are never as quiet as they think they are. One person tells one cousin, who tells one aunt, who tells one brother, who tells someone else over coffee, and soon the truth has found a dozen voices. Dennis called me from Phoenix, furious on my behalf. He said Tiffany's behavior was disgraceful, and that it fit a long pattern nobody had wanted to name out loud. He said the family had been tiptoeing around her for too long. I listened because he was not wrong, but I also told him I was fine. And in truth, I was fine in one sense and not fine in another. I was not angry enough to burn down the house, but I was awake now. That was the difference. I had lived too many years pretending not to notice the little indignities because I believed that peace required silence. But there is a point where silence stops being grace and starts becoming surrender. And I had reached mine. Robert called me 3 days later. He told me he and Tiffany had talked. He told me she wanted to come apologize. 2 days after that, they came to my house. I remember that afternoon with painful clarity. The coffee smelled strong. My living room was neat. The afternoon light came through the curtains in a way that made everything look softer than it felt. I sat in my favorite chair. My own chair. In my own house. And I waited. Tiffany sat across from me looking smaller than I had ever seen her. Not younger. Not kinder. Just smaller. The kind of smallness that comes when a person realizes the room no longer bends to their will. She said she was sorry for raising her voice at the wedding. She said she was sorry for making a scene. It was not the fullest apology I had ever received, and I would not insult the truth by pretending otherwise. But she said the words. And sometimes the beginning of humility is simply the willingness to say them at all. So I accepted the apology. Not because everything had been magically repaired. Not because I had suddenly forgotten how she had spoken to me. I accepted it because I am 79 years old and I know that peace is not something you give to someone else to prove they deserve it. Peace is something you choose for your own spirit when you have carried enough weight. After they left, I sat alone for a while and thought about all the years I had spent trying to preserve a balance that was never really balanced in the first place. I thought about how often women my age are expected to be agreeable, patient, accommodating, and invisible in exactly the moments when they most deserve respect. And I made a decision. I would no longer make myself smaller to make someone else comfortable. Not Tiffany. Not anyone. I would not move my seat when I had been placed there with care. I would not step aside when I had been invited. I would not lower my voice when my dignity was being tested. I had earned my place in this family. I had earned my place in this world. And I would sit where I was placed unless I chose to move on my own. That was the quiet promise I made to myself that afternoon. And it changed me. Not into someone bitter. Not into someone cruel. Just into someone harder to dismiss. A month later, Gerald and Denise came to visit me. They brought dried flowers from their honeymoon pressed into a little frame. And Denise told me she was so glad I had been there for their wedding. That made me tear up, I will not lie. I am old enough now not to apologize for tears. Tears are not weakness. Sometimes they are simply the body's way of making room for love. We sat in my living room and laughed and talked and looked through wedding photographs. Patricia called from Charlotte while I was still holding the frame and insisted on seeing it over video call, which of course took longer than necessary because I could not make the camera behave. My garden was doing well that season. Carol and I had lunch on the porch one Tuesday and laughed so hard we both got hiccups. Robert began calling more often. Our conversations became easier, warmer, more like the old days before everything got tangled up. He sounded more himself, more honest, less careful. Tiffany did not become my best friend. I want to say that plainly. Life is not a fairy tale, and apologies do not erase every bruise. But something had shifted in the household. I could feel it through Robert, through the careful way he began speaking, through the way he no longer brushed past hard moments as if ignoring them would make them vanish. What mattered most to me was not winning some argument or punishing Tiffany. I was never interested in that. What mattered was that I had finally stopped betraying myself in the name of keeping everyone else comfortable. There is a particular kind of pain that women learn to recognize only after decades of living. The pain of being talked over, corrected, repositioned, and quietly expected to absorb the discomfort without protest. I had done that for years and I no longer intended to do it again. I am 79 years old. I have buried a husband. I have raised children. I have worked an honest job for 31 years. I have comforted the grieving, guided children toward books that opened their worlds, and spent enough nights alone with my thoughts to know exactly who I am. I do not need to prove my worth. I do not need to fight for a seat that was already mine. And I certainly do not need to accept being embarrassed in front of a room full of people, because someone else believes her comfort matters more than my dignity. That wedding taught me something I wish I had learned sooner. There comes a moment in every woman's life when she must decide whether to keep shrinking or finally stand still and say enough. I stood still. And I said enough. The next time I wore my pearl earrings, I did it with a little more pride. Not because they are fancy and not because my dress is especially elegant, but because they belong to my mother, and my mother taught me that dignity is not loud. It is steady. It is knowing who you are when someone else tries to make you forget. It is holding your head up when someone expects you to bow it. It is sitting in the seat you were given and refusing to yield it to disrespect. That is the story, exactly as it happened, from my little house on Elm Creek Road in Savannah, Georgia. The afternoon sun is still lovely here. My coffee still goes cold when I talk too long. And I still love my family, even when they test my patience. But from now on, I will not disappear just to keep the peace. Not at a wedding. Not at my table. Not in my own life. And that, I believe, is the beginning of a much better kind of story.